So yesterday, during a Senate Appropriations Committee hearing, Senator John Kennedy decided to do something that sounds simple on paper and explosive in practice. He asked Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick why the government is spending roughly $4,000 per location on fiber broadband when a Starlink terminal costs about $600. And on the surface, that sounds like common sense. Why spend $4,000 when you can spend $600? Why lay fiber when satellites already exist? Why not just save taxpayers billions and call it a day? But here's where it gets interesting. Because the answer wasn't, that's wrong. It wasn't, your math is off. It was, the states decided. And the moment the conversation shifted from numbers to process, you could see what this was really about. This wasn't just a debate about internet service. It was a clash over federal oversight, infrastructure policy, and who controls how billions in broadband funds get allocated. Let's watch what happened, and then I'll break down what's really going on here. Watch this closely. Pay attention to how the math argument turns into a process argument.
Somebody designed the damn thing on purpose. Final question, I'm going to hurry, Mr. Chairman. Why don't you just use satellite internet service? Why don't you just use Global Star or Starlink? You said the cost is $4,000 per person in Louisiana. For $600, you can buy a Starlink terminal. Why don't you just do that? And do it across America and save a bunch of money.
The states were responsible for determining the best outcome, and sometimes fiber in a dense location can be economically better. Sometimes satellite does not work best on geography.
It can't be cheaper. That's not impossible. It can be cheaper.
Math is, each of the states did their best. We worked it out with them, and we moved on.
I just don't understand. You can buy, I'm not saying do Musk. There are others that just throw it out for bid. But $600 for a terminal versus $4,000 for fiber optic? This is taxpayer money. I'm done. I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. Madam Chairman. I should have known it's you, Shelley. You're much nicer than Jerry. He would have cut me off.
Yeah, Senator Shaheen.
If that exchange felt like two people arguing past each other, that's because they were. Kennedy framed it as simple arithmetic. $600 versus $4,000. Taxpayer money versus waste. Lutnick framed it as administrative discretion. States chose. Different terrain. Different economics. And when you strip away the tone, what you're left with is something deeper than a pricing dispute. You're watching a classic political maneuver. Reduce a complex infrastructure program to a clean soundbite, then dare the other side to defend nuance in 30 seconds. Why not just use satellite? It sounds so obvious that if you push back, you look evasive. And that's exactly why it works. Here's what wasn't explained in that clip. The broadband funding Kennedy is referencing is tied to federal infrastructure programs passed under recent broadband expansion initiatives, including the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. That law allocated tens of billions of dollars to expand high-speed internet access, particularly in rural and underserved areas. But, and this is critical, the funding is administered through states. States submit plans. States determine technology mix. States evaluate terrain, density, long-term capacity, and sustainability. Fiber is expensive up front, but fiber has one major advantage: capacity and stability over decades. Satellite, including services like Starlink, is faster to deploy and cheaper per terminal. But performance varies by congestion, weather, and bandwidth sharing. So the debate is not just cost per unit. It's long-term infrastructure strategy versus short-term deployment speed. And that complexity? It doesn't fit in a viral clip. Let's ground this procedurally. The Senate Appropriations Committee's role is oversight and funding review. Under Article 1 of the Constitution, Congress holds the power of the purse. But once Congress appropriates funds and delegates implementation authority to executive agencies and state governments, execution decisions shift. In this case, broadband deployment decisions are governed by federal statute and administered through the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, NTIA. The statutory framework allows states to determine the most cost-effective technology to meet federal standards. It does not mandate satellite. It does not mandate fiber. It mandates service benchmarks: speed, reliability, scalability. So when Lutnick says the states were responsible, that's not a dodge. That's literally how the statute is structured. However, and this is where Kennedy's question has force, congressional oversight exists precisely to examine whether those delegated decisions are economically rational. Oversight hearings are not rubber stamps. They are interrogations of execution. So the legal structure here is layered. Congress appropriates, agencies administer, states implement, Congress reviews. This is not just about internet service. It's about federalism and delegated authority. And when Kennedy reduces that to math is math, he's compressing a multi-layered statutory process into a headline. It's effective, but it's incomplete. This isn't really about Starlink versus fiber. It's about narrative simplicity versus policy complexity. Kennedy's move is strategic minimalism. Pick a number, make it clean, make it shocking. $600 versus $4,000. That's a 6x multiplier. You don't need charts. You don't need white papers. You just need outrage.
And if Lutnick pushes back with nuance, terrain analysis, long-term throughput, regulatory compliance,
it sounds bureaucratic. That's the trap. Because infrastructure policy doesn't sell well in 30-second math comparisons. But here's the deeper layer. Satellite internet is often associated with private sector innovation, particularly companies like Starlink. Fiber expansion is associated with long-term public infrastructure investment. So the subtext becomes, why are we building expensive public systems when private alternatives exist? That's not a cost question. That's an ideological one. And when Kennedy says, this is taxpayer money, he's signaling fiscal guardianship. That's not accidental. It reframes the hearing from, how should broadband be deployed, to, why is government overspending? That shift matters politically, because it simplifies accountability into price tags. Here's why this matters beyond one hearing. If infrastructure decisions get reduced to terminal cost comparisons, long-term planning gets flattened. Fiber networks are capital investments meant to last decades. Satellite terminals are consumer devices dependent on subscription ecosystems and bandwidth capacity. If Congress begins treating those as interchangeable line items, oversight becomes headline-driven rather than outcome-driven. And that creates pressure on agencies to optimize for optics, not durability. Because no one wants to defend a $4,000 figure on cable news. The broader risk isn't that satellite is bad or fiber is perfect. The risk is policy being evaluated solely through viral arithmetic. Infrastructure isn't a Black Friday sale, it's generational planning. And when hearings become cost per unit debates without context, long-term strategy loses to short-term sound bites. That's not accountability, that's compression. Reducing national broadband strategy to, why not just buy the cheaper box, is like asking why cities build bridges when boats are cheaper. Sure, a boat costs less, until you need to move 10,000 cars at once. This wasn't just a pricing argument. It was a battle over whether infrastructure should be judged by immediate cost, or by long-term capacity. And that's a very different conversation.